Hello? Hello and good afternoon. Can I ask everyone to just come in and take their seats, please? My name is Abigail Golden Vasquez, and I'm a Vice President and Deputy Director of Leadership Initiatives at the Aspen Institute. I'm incredibly excited about this panel today, a discussion with former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright with 4 fellows from the Aspen Global Leadership Network from South Africa, from Lebanon, China, and Panama. I'd like to start by introducing Hildegard Vasquez, of no direct relation to me, but a soul sister. She's a Central America Leadership Initiative Fellow, an architect from Panama, who chose not only to rehabilitate the crumbling historic district of Panama City, but also the lives of marginalized women living there, putting them on a path to permanent employment, and importantly, a way to stay in their homes. She's also a 2012 John P. McNulty Prize laureate. Ramez Shehadi is an Executive Vice President and International Managing Director at Booz Allen Hamilton. He's a Middle East Leadership Initiative Fellow. He has built a digital business to reconnect the global Arab diaspora with the cultural content of their origin. He's from Lebanon, but essentially lives on an airplane. Next, Heather Sonn is an Africa Leadership Initiative South Africa Fellow and a moderator for the Aspen Global Leadership Network. She is co-founder and managing director of Gamiro Investment Group, which invests in renewable energy, agriculture, and financial services with the aim of having a positive social impact. She's also working to create hope and access to meaningful work for young women from abused backgrounds in South Africa through training and skills development. Desmond Shum is a Henry Crown Fellow and the president of Aeropolis Group, which invests in, develops, and operates large-scale airport-related real estate projects. Desmond is from China and has co-founded Kaifeng Charity Foundation, one of the first private foundations established in China at a national level. He also supports a program to help wealthy families in China build intentional philanthropy and give back to society. And last, but by no means least, is former US Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright. Known the world over, she needs no introduction. You all heard her last night during the announcement and celebration of the John P. McNulty Prize laureates, so I won't repeat her bio, which is in the program book. However, I would be remiss not to mention and say a word about what an important member of the Aspen Institute family she is. She's an active Institute trustee, a member of the Aspen Strategy Group, a judge for the John P. McNulty Prize, and so much more. On a personal note, she's been a hero of mine going back to 1993 when I was an international relations student and she became US Ambassador to the United Nations. As a woman in this traditionally male-dominated field, she's been a first in many things, but that isn't what makes her stand out. It's simply that she is so good. She's a brilliant diplomat, a businesswoman, a leader, an important writer, thinker, and influencer. She's known for her quick wit and speaking her mind. She's quite simply an icon. So you are in for a treat with this entire group. And with that, I'd like to ask Hildegard Vasquez to kick us off with the first question.
Thank you very much, Abigail. Thank you, Madam Secretary. We're really excited to actually get the opportunity to talk about issues that are important to us and how, in a way, you've disrupted the world. Going back to Central America, this recent and sudden influx of immigrant children from Central America running away from drug-induced violence has turned into an international border crisis. How do you feel about comments that this is a Central American problem, considering that the war on drugs is causing most of the violence?
Well, thank you very much for asking that question, and I'm really pleased to be able to think about it with you. I am very troubled by seeing pictures of children not being allowed to come into the United States. I'm an immigrant, and when people ask me what's the most important thing that ever happened to me, hands down, it's coming to America. So I am probably the wrong person to ask about what happens if people feel a need to come to this country and we don't let them in. So I am quite appalled by some of the behavior to do with this, and I hope that we can figure it out. I also, I was thinking, I have been to everywhere, but recently in the Middle East, in terms of issues of people being refugees or coming into a country, you're from Lebanon. Lebanon has more refugees than it has native people there. Syria, I was in Jordan. Jordan has so many refugees, it's as if the United States had 40 million refugees, and we're having trouble dealing with a few thousand children, so I'm quite appalled. The other thing, though, that I have to say is I have, in my official life, been very involved with the whole issue of the drug problem in Latin America and how it is affected by the United States drug use. And I know that the standard thing to say is this is America's fault because we basically should not be using drugs. However, I do think that Central America and Latin America bear some responsibility for this also, that their laws are not strong enough, that there is a group of people who are making an awful lot of money off of being part of cartels and gangs. And I do know that when President Obama met with the presidents of the countries, 3 countries, that they talked about the communal way that we could deal with this. This is a problem for the Americas, and I have believed that we need to work on this together. By the way, the most revolutionary thing I did while I was Secretary of State was to move Canada into the Western Hemisphere. It actually was in Europe, according to the State Department. And so I thought it was for the solidarity of the Americas and to have another democracy to move Canada into the Western Hemisphere, because it actually is in the Western Hemisphere. So that is the most radical thing I ever did.
Yeah, thank you. It's your turn.
Oh, I was just so interested in listening. Well, Madam Secretary, I warned you that the questions were going to be tough, so let's get into it. The situation in Gaza is beyond extreme, and the disparity in the stats is very public and very clear that the civilian impact dominates by far. Given the direct nature of U.S. relationships and allegiances in the region, why can't the U.S. immediately and definitively alleviate the humanitarian situation in line with the founding principles of this great nation, and bring the relevant representative leaders to the table, as you and President Clinton and others have done in the past? And how do you forecast this situation and relationships evolving from this stage?
I have tried very hard to put all this into context from the basis of my experience and from the academic world. And let me just say the following thing, which is that there is something going on in the world all the time. We just talked about Central America. It is normal for there to be problems between countries, among countries. The job of the diplomats is trying on an hourly basis to deal with them, so people are used to this. But there have been 2 things that have happened in the last 6 months that are game changers. One of them is the Russian annexation of Crimea and the Russian behavior, and the other is everything that is happening in the greater Middle East, in terms of ISIS, in terms of generally what's happening in Iraq and Syria and your country. And then now the Israeli-Palestinian issue, which I think, while is always a discrete issue of its own, is now also part of this much larger story of competition, nationalism, and various other influences that we can talk about later. I personally spent an awful lot of time working on the Israeli-Palestinian issue. I think if I were to ask any of you whether you'd like to go to Camp David, I think you'd probably say yes. I can tell you after 2 weeks in the rain with the Israelis and Palestinians, I don't care if I ever go back. I have been through many very long negotiations, and the United States always does play a key role. But the United States cannot provide the political will to the parties to the conflict in order to make a decision. We can put all kinds of things, ideas on the table. We often talk about bridging proposals, a variety of different aspects. There is no lack of imagination in what can be done. The problem is the political will. And I have to say, Hamas is a terrorist organization. I am the one that put it on the terrorist list. They meet the definition of it. I think the Palestinian Authority needs to exert more influence. They need to figure out. I was fascinated by the way that the technical government was put together. I think it is possible for countries to talk to them, and that is what's happening. Secretary Kerry is spending a lot of time talking to those that might have an influence there. So I think that part is very important. The tragedy that you're talking about is a major tragedy in terms of humanitarian issues, and I do think that the international community has to pursue more ideas, all of the kinds of things you're talking about, of trying to bring the parties together around a table. The problem is that this issue has been with us a very long time. We know, frankly, we know what the solution is. I am obviously very proud to have worked for President Clinton. President Clinton, before he left office, put down the parameters for what the solution is, a two-state solution where there is respect for each other, end to conflict, refugees, a number of different ways that they can be dealt with, and a way for these two peoples to live together. It is on the table, it has been there, and I think it requires the political will to have something happen. And the United States is willing, I know, and prepared to help, but ultimately it's the political will.
Madam Secretary, also very happy to have the conversation with you. It feels a little bit surreal. Looking at you, I almost can't believe it, and I look at the monitor, and that kind of makes more sense, seeing you on TV. So I'm really pleased to be having the conversation. So we, very recently, the BRICS countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, have formed a bank, the New Development Bank, albeit with an initial small amount of capital. It also, the idea is, well, the countries represent 40% of the world's population and approximately 20% of the world's GDP. So it also comes in the context of sustained calls for reforms of the Bretton Woods institutions. So my question is this a good thing? Is it developing countries setting their own agenda, setting their own priorities, finding creative solutions to their own problems? Or is it a threatening move, given the balance of power implications?
I don't see it as a threatening move. And let me just say, there can never be enough development assistance. There are a number of different ways of providing it through the official organizations, Bretton Woods, also countries' bilateral assistance, and everything that the discussions that I've been involved in here and every place else I go, there is basically a sense that people need help in terms of their economic development, whether it's in agriculture or in a variety of new businesses. So there can be, as far as I'm concerned, there can never be enough. I think the United States at the moment, there are some IMF reforms up before Congress. Our Congress can't seem to do anything about anything. But the bottom line is that there really are reforms that I think would be useful. They are being supported. And there are a number of other development banks that are part of the international system. I personally, when I read about the BRIC Bank being set up, saw it as complementary. What I don't like, it's so wonderful not to be in the government, I say whatever, is the way that President Putin talks about it. He acted as though his trip to Latin America was basically in your face, and that he wanted to set up a competing development bank and everything that goes with it. And so I think it is very, I actually think it's good for the BRICS to develop a developing bank. They'll see it's not simple, but I don't think it should be portrayed as something that is a bank that is set up in competition, but it could be in cooperation. I think one of the hardest things for the world to get away from, I got to the United Nations in 1993 at the beginning of the end of the Cold War period. And I think countries had a hard time sorting out where they belonged. So there was, and continues to be, a non-aligned movement. And I'd say, well, what are you non-aligned between? The Cold War is over. And so I do think, whether one talks about north-south issues or various kinds of other ways of developing versus developed, it's not the nomenclature. It's basically what can be done by cooperation. And I would see the BRIC banks as a good method, tool, but not one if it's just deliberately set up in a way to be anti-American.
Madam Secretary, my question is such. I think since the Second World War, U.S. has been mostly seen as a moral authority globally. And, I would say China, until probably 5-10 years ago, aspired to be the United States, of the future sometime. Say we want democracy, we want liberty, we want the same thing you want. But we are not so sure when we're going to get there. Even direct election, we want that. But I think in the last 15 years, with the war in Afghanistan, the war in Iraq, the financial crisis, and Eric Snowden, I think a lot of people would argue or say the American moral authority is, some would say eroding, some would say has disappeared. And in your view, and then I think it's actually a bad thing for the world. I mean, it seems like the world today is ruled by the law of the jungle. Who has more power and who has a bigger gun? In your view, how do you think U.S. can rebuild that moral authority?
Well, first of all, I do believe, and having answered the immigration question, I do believe that the U.S. is an exceptional country. It was founded in a very different way. We talked about revolutions when we were together. And it is a country that has more diversity and basically accepts people from a variety of different backgrounds. In my own case, I came here when I was 11 years old, and I ended up as Secretary of State. How can I not say it's an exceptional country? So the bottom line is I believe that America is exceptional. I believe that America needs a moral foreign policy, but not a moralistic foreign policy. Moralistic being telling everybody what to do all the time, and doing it in a way that puts us in the role of being the world's policeman, which Americans don't want to be. Americans, if you were to poll the American public, they do not want to be the world's policeman. But I do think people want to see America with a foreign policy that is value-based, i.e., respect for the role of the individual, the possibility for people to be able to improve their lives, mobility, and sticking up for human rights. I think that one of the things that does happen is that, having been in the international arena, that people expect, and I was very proud to talk about the necessity for human rights everywhere in the world. By the way, whenever I had a meeting with the Chinese, we had I have to tell this story because a lot of the meetings are so kind of stilted, and the Chinese would always talk about Taiwan, and I would always talk about Tibet, and I finally said, here are my talking points, give me your talking points, and let's have a discussion about the strategy, the strategic aspect. And I do think that it is very important for the United States to make clear what our values are, and to do it even in very difficult bilateral relationships. And I think that the way that the United States can exert its role is to live up to what people believe in. Now, what I don't think is that the United States should be the sole superpower. President Clinton said it first and said that we were the indispensable nation. I said it so often that it became identified with me. But there is nothing in the definition of indispensable that says alone. It just means that the United States needs to be engaged. And so I believe that we need partners, and we look for partners in countries that can share some of the aspects of our value system, that are willing to also make sure that there's not drug trafficking, or that there is development, or in fact that there is not suffering. The international community has let the Middle East down. That is how I feel. The international community has not helped enough in Latin America, and also the international community needs to be more involved in development.
Moving on with the policing idea of the United States, you have stated in the past that the only way to normalize Cuban-US relations is if Castro moves, which now we have a new Castro, by the way, towards a democratic transition and allows the Cuban people to have independent activity. How do you feel about Hillary Clinton's recent statement that the US should advocate for the end of the Cuban embargo and normalize relations?
I'm going to take a little time on this question because other people, I think, have come up to me to ask me this. When President Clinton first came into office, the idea actually was to normalize, to do everything we could to normalize relations with Cuba. The embargo was an executive action, and there was a sense from President Clinton that he wanted to see some change. We, in fact, had a small group that was working on it. I was at the United Nations at the time when the Cubans shot down unarmed Cuban planes piloted by unarmed Cuban Americans. And my instructions at the UN were to make absolutely sure that Cuba was condemned for the action that they took. The planes were, as I said, unarmed. They were flying over international waters, and the Cubans had committed a crime. What is interesting is, and some people have asked me about this given what just happened in Ukraine, the United States gave me the transcript of what the Cubans were saying to each other in order to show to the other Security Council members how deliberate this action was. And everything was translated into English except one Spanish word. It's the only Spanish word I know. It said that the Cubans were saying, we have cojones, they don't have cojones, we will get there. So I shocked the UN press corps when I came up with a line in front of them, which is, it's not cojones, it's cowardice. President Clinton loved the line. He said that it was, and so what happened was that I was asked to represent him in Miami for the memorial ceremony in honor of the fallen pilots. And I was told very rightly that this was a very serious occasion and there would be no jokes, nothing. So I am walking in, the ceremony was in the Orange Bowl, and I walked in through the tunnel the way the dolphins come in, and all of a sudden 60,000 Cubans stood up and started chanting, Madam Cojones, Madam Cojones. So it is one of my favorite titles. But what happened as a result of the shoot down was that the executive order became a law, Helms-Burton. And the Clinton administration believed that we should live up to the law. And so we were trying to sort out ways to help the Cuban people and stay within the law. But it was the law. I think the issue for me, and I have spent a lot of time on this, is that Castro and the other Castro used the embargo as an excuse to explain why Cuba doesn't have the best economy in the world. And I think it is not serving its purpose. And I do know, what's interesting are the politics in Florida, which the Cubans themselves, the Cuban Americans, are going through many changes. The generation that came from Cuba that think they're going to return to an island that doesn't exist anymore, and they are older, then their children are another generation, and they feel very strongly about this for good reason, because they came to this country. And then the third group are those who were already born in the United States, and they have different views. And I think that the Cuban American community has to be a part of this discussion, but I also think that there is no point in having an embargo that is not serving its purpose, that is limiting the possibilities of Cubans to be able to have a better life. But it's an act that Congress has to repeal. And I do think we need to look at it and the politics of it and what it does for Latin America.
Thank you.
Back to the Middle East. Over the duration of the Gaza conflict, the toll to civilians in Syria has in fact been significantly higher. Libya and Iraq continue to boil with tension and conflict, but these seemingly have all waned in public coverage and attention. What drives U.S. capacity and priority of involvement in the region?
I think that one of the hardest parts here is there are things going on everywhere that people's capacity, including those in the government, to follow everything all the time is very hard. And it's fascinating to kind of watch our news programs where one thing blocks out something else. And I am distressed when I see that people forget about a certain part of the world that requires our attention. The United States took over a very difficult role at the end of World War II as the British gave up their kind of guarantor approach to the Middle East. And we have clearly cared about the Middle East for a number of reasons. I have never liked the idea that we think that oil is the basis of our foreign policy. It is not. But clearly it plays a part. Our relationship with Israel is absolutely key. I think people need to understand that. The United States, under President Truman, recognized Israel. There is a relationship that we have with Israel that is unlike any other in the region, and it is key, and I think that needs to be understood. I think also we do care about the sovereignty of various countries and the possibility of a normal, decent life for the people there. So we do have an interest, there's no question, strategically, talking about a moral foreign policy. So I think we have to understand America's interest in it. What is difficult is that I don't think many Americans actually know enough about the Middle East. President Clinton read a lot. He assigned books to me. One he told me to read was The Peace to End All Peace by David Fromkin, an American historian, who describes the creation of the modern Middle East. The short version of the book is, the modern Middle East was created after World War I by the British and French bureaucracies lying to each other. And the countries, in many ways, were created with artificial borders. And what we're dealing with now is the kind of erasing or marginalizing of the borders. And then I have to say, I'm sorry to give such a long answer, but it's really, I am the first American official to put Muslim holidays on the calendar, to have had iftar dinners, and try to do something to teach the Americans about Islam. Most Americans knew very little, and they certainly didn't know the difference between a Shia and a Sunni. And also, we're not well enough aware of the competition between Arabs and Persians. And so all that is happening in the Middle East at this moment. And I do think that the part that makes this difficult is, what is America's role in this? I am often asked about what is the difference between what happened in Central and Eastern Europe after the fall of the wall and what just happened with the Arab awakening. And by the way, let me just interrupt myself here. I was in a public discussion with an Arab at Georgetown University 2 years ago in the winter, and I said, we've been calling it the Arab Spring, but it's the winter, so we can't call it that anymore. So let's call it the Arab Awakening. And he got really angry at me. And he said, that is outrageous. The Arabs haven't been asleep all this time. And I said, what would you call it? And he said, Arab troubles. And I said, what about Arab opportunities? So just in those sentences, you can see the difference about it. And so in contrast to Central and Eastern Europe, that was a deliberate desire by many of the people, the Poles, the Czechs, et cetera, to be Europeans and be part of the West. That doesn't seem to be the motivating factor for what is happening in the Arab world. And so I think we're having a hard time understanding it. And just a little commercial here. President Obama gave a speech in Cairo in which he said we need to have a different relationship with Muslim-majority countries. Secretary Clinton wanted to work with that project and asked me to run something called Partners for a New Beginning, which is how to have relationships with Muslim-majority countries, public-private partnerships, working on economic empowerment, science and technology, education, and people-to-people exchanges, and to get women and youth involved. I chair it. Muhtar Kent from Coca-Cola is the vice chair, and Walter Isaacson from Aspen is the other vice chair, and Aspen is the secretariat for this. So we are trying to work on a lot of the issues that I think are at the basis of what's happening in the Middle East, which is not enough economic opportunity and the capability of people to run their own lives. So sorry, such a long answer.
Thank you.
The idea of the sort of altruistic promotion of democracy and the quest for new markets, which is prevalent, and sometimes those messages get confused on the part of the intentions of America. So I agree with you in what you said in terms of we need new ways of doing things, we need new approaches, and you use the example of America doesn't need to be, nor should it be, the only superpower. So it kind of points to an idea that we don't have to follow the patterns of the past. And I think also not to create and promote those ideas that get us into the same position that we come out of. So President Obama is welcoming African heads of state and business leaders to Washington and New York to an Africa summit. This comes in the context of a massive push from China in terms of building economic relations on the continent of Africa over several years now. Is there concern on the part of the US on what the intentions are and what may play out in that scenario, and is there a need to react or to respond to that in the context of the question of not recreating patterns that have not served us in the past?
I believe that the United States has been interested in having relations with African countries individually for a very long time. I know when we were in office, we had the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act. President Clinton went to Africa a number of times. I did, and I think we worked very hard to try to understand that Africa wasn't one country, that actually there are some very good news stories, some complications, and that there was a natural relationship. So this is not something that just came up. And President Obama has had an interest in working with individual African countries and leaders. This is going to be a very interesting summit. I'm glad I'm not going to be in Washington because it will be crazy. But partially what is interesting about it, and I was talking with some people this morning about it, there is a business conference that goes on simultaneously that Bloomberg is sponsoring in terms of having executives there and really showing the importance in something that I mentioned in terms of the Middle East. I find public-private partnerships a fascinating tool of operating in terms of the dynamism of the private sector and the organizational aspects and contacts that the public sector has. And so a lot has to do, that's going to be one of the agenda items, and looking at the good news stories in Africa. There is no question that as the U.S. looks at each country in Africa, there is a sense trying to figure out what the Chinese are doing. And some of it, Desmond, you'll have to argue with me on this, has to do with the extractive industries and trying to figure out China is energy hungry, and it is doing whatever it can to establish its roots. What I find fascinating is the following. Initially, I think there was a great attraction by some of the African countries of actually attracting China and Chinese workers. I think there's some disillusionment a little bit with it because a lot of the Chinese industries are not local. What American companies do a lot is not only be global, but are local partners in those countries. But an example of something, I was in Kenya a couple of years ago, and they were talking about building a road, Nairobi into the Serengeti, and You know, American companies had to know what the environmental regulations were and how this would work. But the Chinese arrived and said, where do you want it? And so I think there is kind of that issue in terms of what are our rules. Then the Millennium Challenge account in terms of conditionality and various aspects. And I think we're not going to change. This has to do with kind of what is American foreign policy about. And I do think that I think our competition or our best cards are those when we believe that people want to run their own countries, that they want to be able to have environmentally sound companies, that they don't want the mines just extracted and not worry about the health of the workers. And so I think that we are on the right track. But there definitely is that sense of competition about it. And it'll be interesting to see what the results of this summit are.
I was going to ask a question related to a multipolar world order, but but I think when you earlier answered the question about U.S. being a indispensable nation, but you welcome other nations at the table, so I think that's the question we can drop. And I think we were trying, really hard to sort of like, can we just pinpoint her to a corner and come up with the impossible answer she just have to give? And obviously we neither have the knowledge nor the skill to do that. So I'm gonna tap your knowledge. China has been, internally actually in the elite circle, I think until this administration, there was a lot of discussion where this country, actually there's a lot of question about, is this thing going to fall apart? And when does that going to happen? There was a lot of talk about that. And then a lot of discussion about that. And then this administration, I think, has really taken this nation on a different course. This is a strong man. It's a strong man politics. Nobody foresee it coming. And as a result, the discussion, the debate has changed a lot internally. I'm going to ask you, given your knowledge, where do you see China in, let's say, 2030, 15 years from now? Not your wish list. That's your forecast.
Well, first of all, I think that whenever anybody these days talks about China, they just say rising. It's always, that is the major change in the multinational, multipolar system. I have spent quite a lot of time thinking about China, and most recently, I've been involved in some fairly peculiar discussions with the International Department of the Chinese Communist Party. And what happened was that they wanted to meet with Democrats and Republicans, some political leaders, to have discussions. So I have to tell this story because it's so crazy, the Republicans didn't want to go. And I thought, over my dead body, are the Democrats going to go meet with the communists by ourselves? What happened then was that the Republicans did decide to go. And it was really, when you're Secretary of State, you choose the delegation that's at the table with you. So this was a little bit of a pickup team. And so on the Democratic side, I chaired it. And then Howard Dean, former chairman of the Democratic Party, and Tom Daschle, former senator and majority leader. And on the Republican side, Rich Williamson, who unfortunately died recently but had been Romney's foreign policy advisor, Mike Duncan, the former chairman of the Republican Party, and Vin Weber, a former member of Congress from Minnesota and also a member of the Aspen board. So we're a great group, but we kind of hadn't focused on what we were going to say. And the Chinese keep talking about how the party works, and I couldn't stand it. After a while, I said, excuse me, but our party system is a little bit different. We don't know how many millions of members we have, and nobody fills out an application fee, and form, and nobody goes to party school, and then people switch parties during elections. And when you're Secretary of State, you would say, Desmond, would you like to say something? But this, as I said, was a pickup team. So Howard Dean all of a sudden says, well, we do know how many members we have because of the great database I set up. And then Mike Duncan, the Republican not to be outdone, said, yes, and we did psychological profiles of 200 million people. And the Chinese eyes are going around. And Rich Williamson, whom I'd never seen before in my life, writes me a note, forever endearing himself to me, saying, if that's so, how come we lost the election? So then the Chinese came back in a couple of years after a party congress. We'd had an election. They are all on message. We don't really know who won this time, and the House is divided and all kinds. So, but the reason I'm telling you this is why did they want this meeting? And my sense is that the reason they want this, and we go on, is that there is pressure at the bottom of the pyramid in China, that people are worried about the environment. They are worried about some of the land confiscations and a number of different things that do kind of, and I think that the Chinese and Xi Jinping is not only trying to reestablish the role of the party, but is also trying to figure out how to get rid of corruption and also how, in fact, to be able to respond to some of the needs of the people. I think trying to run China must be unbelievably hard in terms of size and numbers and the role of the party and the fact that people have, in many ways, signed a contract to have a better economic life. You and I talked about this. I happen to believe we're all the same. I think everybody wants to be able to make decisions about his or her own life at a certain stage. And I think that's going to happen in China also. I would hope, you're right, I should separate my hopes from the forecast. I think that the forecast could be fairly dangerous, partially because of the energy hunger. The Chinese don't care about those rocks in the South and East China Sea. They care what's under them. And the energy things that are going on, the conflicts that might, in fact, come as a result of that. We already saw some problems with Vietnam. And then what really frightens me is that there is a rise of, patriotism is nice, nationalism is dangerous. And I think the hyperactivity in terms of nationalist feelings, not only in China, but Japan and South Korea, is very dangerous. And the United States, by the way, the United States is not monogamous. We are both a Pacific and an Atlantic power. And the United States cares about what happens in the Pacific and wants to have a functional relationship with China. And the question that I have is whether the desire for more power for the People's Liberation Army and the reaction to that from the American military isn't something that we have to watch out for.
Okay, I think we have a little bit of time to open up to questions from the audience.
Madam Secretary, I know you joined some of the discussions this week. One of the readings we had was Margaret Macmillan's Great War's Ominous Echoes. I don't know if you were in the room, but for the benefit of the rest of us, first, are you worried that we may be missing the signs this time, as we did 100 years ago? And second, do you think we have the leadership and the institutions to deal with it?
Let me just say, about 3 weeks ago, I was in a discussion in New York with Margaret Macmillan, Henry Kissinger, Scott Berg, who wrote a biography of Woodrow Wilson, and then another professor who was an expert on everything that the Archduke had on, what he'd eaten, what the car looked like. And we had a very interesting discussion about, the first question was, to me, was the war avoidable or unavoidable? And I said avoidable, because I believe every war is avoidable. Then we also, in the end, everybody agreed with me, except in the question from the audience, Sana Sharma, a great historian, who thought that the war was unavoidable. So there's always that discussion that goes on. The thing that I think makes life quite different at this point is basically, the military had begun to form up and the military alliances, and there really was not enough control, civilian control over the military, is kind of the short answer. However, I have to say, in the last few days, as I study what President Putin is doing, it makes me nervous because I think he doesn't have a clue what he's doing, and nationalism has come into the picture. And he has he's in a box because basically he has identified himself with the soul of the Russian nation and the fact that it hasn't been treated right, and he's very, very popular in Russia. At the same time, the sanctions and things are really hurting his economy, and the Europeans are pulling together more and being pretty tough. And I do get nervous about miscalculations. The shoot down of the Malaysian plane was a mistake. They were trying to shoot down a military plane, but they did shoot down a civilian plane, and it goes to show what the problems of accident can be. We have put into places, people have all read the history, places that are kind of fail-safe so that you don't get into the same situation, and I don't think we will. But it is definitely a lesson in terms of what can happen, and history teaches us a lot. History also teaches us a lot about how World War II began. And I wrote a book called Prague Winter, which is mostly about Czechoslovakia. But I went back and I looked at what happened, how Munich happened. As a Czechoslovak, it is the worst thing that ever happened to a country which was sold down the river. And what I find interesting, and I always precede this by saying that historical analogies are very dangerous. There's no question, because there's something always very different. But it is worth knowing. So the British and French were exhausted from World War I. They had lost a whole generation of young men. Their budget was a mess. Their military didn't work. And while I will always believe that Neville Chamberlain is one of the more odious characters in history, I can understand what happened. He and the French were going to do everything they could to avoid war. And they actually said, why should we care about people in faraway places with unpronounceable names? And if you look at what is happening in the Middle East, we are tired from Iraq and Afghanistan, so why should we care about people in faraway places with unpronounceable names?
Madam Secretary, when I think about ISIS and what's happening with women, especially in the region, I know that this was a decision that you wrestled with when you were secretary about what happens to the women during the Taliban rule. What I'm hearing is that they're ordering circumcision, they're doing the same thing they did years ago, and I just wonder, is that a reason for military intervention, or what? It doesn't seem to be garnering any kind of outcry. And so I'm just wondering if things like that, human rights violations like those, are worthy of military intervention.
Well, let me say, I think I teach a course at Georgetown. I say foreign policy is just trying to get some country to do what you want. That's all it is. So what are the tools? And the course I teach is called the National Security Toolbox. And it is set up in a way to figure out what does any country do to affect the behavior of another country. One of the issues that is really hard is there's not a lot in that toolbox. There's diplomacy, bilateral and multilateral. It's kind of the bread and butter all the time. There are economic tools, which are the sticks and carrots. There's the threat of the use of force. There's the use of force, intelligence, and law enforcement. That's it. And they work together in a variety of different ways. And one of the reasons that economic sanctions and tools are used so often is that intervention is a very difficult decision and doesn't always achieve what you want. What is interesting is with the rise of non-state actors that really don't have a stake in whether they're protecting their people or their land, the tools are designed to affect the behavior of leaders who care about their people or about the territory that they have. In some ways, ISIS has stepped into the fact that they now think that they control territory, means that some of the tools might work against them, including military intervention. However, I think one has to go back in terms of what is the mood. Would people want to do anything about it? I'm fascinated that you raised the issue of Afghanistan, because in many ways I was blamed for everything, and partially because I stood up for the women, and that we should have recognized the Taliban earlier, and we didn't because of what they were doing to the women. So I do think we need to speak up more about this. I'm not sure that this is something for military intervention, but there definitely needs to be attention needs to be paid to this, and mobilizing some of the other countries and the partners that theoretically have the same values to keep pushing back on it.
Okay, right over there. Can someone get a mic over to?
Speaking of America's role in policing the world, we continue to utilize drones to a greater extent, and it involves infiltrating sovereign nations' airspace for our national protection. What are your thoughts on where that will develop and how it can be controlled?
I am for peace, but I'm not a pacifist. And I do believe that there are times that force has to be used to stop bad behavior in a number, and there are lots of ways to use force. And one of the questions that actually came up during the war in Kosovo was whether it was moral to have an air war if we didn't have troops on the ground. And I actually thought it was a fairly ridiculous argument, since the Serbs were killing people, and we did have the means through an air war to stop it. Now, the drones are somewhat more complicated, but I actually believe that they are effective and need to be used. What we have not done is develop the legal aspects of it in terms of how decisions are made. And it's very interesting. I've had good discussions with the legal advisors, both in state and defense, in terms of how arguments are formed. I do think that from everything that I can tell, there is a very careful way within the U.S. Decision-making process to decide where and when drones are used. The problem is one in which, what is the relationship with the sovereign country? Do they approve of it? Are there circumstances that are different in Yemen than they are in Afghanistan or in the Central African Republic or other places? But for me, I think it is a new tool that has its value and can stop terrible things happening on the ground, but we have not yet developed all the legal aspects of it or had enough of a public discussion about it. I think it's worth really that it become much more a part of, as we talk about what the weapons of war are, and when is it appropriate to use them, when is it not, who is part of the decision-making process.
Madam Secretary, the Israeli war against Gaza, well, better described as the massacre against the Palestinians living in Gaza, we know that it's killing women, children, civilians, bombing houses, schools, hospitals on a daily basis. And I totally understand, and I think Arabs totally understand the significance of the relationship between the U.S. and Israel. But how does this significance justify the aiding and the support of such killing of civilians? Thank you.
I think, first of all, that it's one of these issues which is, how did this all begin? And we can go way back, or we can pick different moments. How did this particular tragedy develop? There are those who say that this, whether one calls it the Third Intifada or just a huge tragedy, did, according to chronology, begin when 3 Israeli boys were kidnapped and murdered. And then also the question about, does a country, there have been rocket fire from Gaza into Israel, and Israel has a right to defend itself. What I think is tragic are the way that I have separated things in my own life, which is my own assessment of this, that with the Iron Dome and the capability that the Israelis had to defend themselves against the rockets, I had said publicly that I was concerned about the huge numbers of Palestinians that were being killed. I am. Where I think there is a new problem that makes it very difficult are the tunnels. And the Israelis do not have a way of defending themselves as I read about these tunnels, in terms of them coming into right outside kibbutzes and various ways with all kinds of strange things in the tunnels, including syringes and uniforms and a variety. I think that is much harder to defend against. I do think that what is going on is an incredible tragedy, and I think that the Israelis have to be, I don't know what the right word is even, more cognizant of the fact that there's always, every death is one too many, but that this is outrageous. I believe it. I do think that it goes back to the question you asked, we need to figure out a way to bring them to a negotiating table. And part of the problem is who has any influence over Hamas? And Secretary Kerry is trying very hard to work out a way to either get the Qataris or the Turks or somebody to have more influence over Hamas. I don't think Hamas is blameless, and I do think that Israel is in a tough position, but I also think that Israel is in danger of losing its moral authority. And I think that we need to try to figure out some kind of a way of bringing them all to the table.
Okay, I think we're going to have to wrap this up. I want to thank you, Madam Secretary. I want to thank everyone for your excellent questions and the audience as well. The next move on our agenda is we're heading over to the Leadership in Action series in the Greenwald tent. Thank you.